So we were sort of talking about having the decompression talk about impassibility last week, but it didn't seem, we weren't able to really talk because of the technical issues. And so I wanted to open up the floor again to comments or questions about impassibility. If there were any, we'll address them, and if not, we'll move into the next thing, which is infinity or infinitude. So impassibility, questions, comments? Everybody remember what it was that we talked about? Okay.
Well, I guess one thing I wanted to say just to kick it off is that in going back through the outline here, it sort of was reminded that all of these past attributes of God that we've been looking at are in the incommunicable attributes section, and the next section is communicable attributes. So just as a sort of I guess encouragement to everyone, if some of this stuff is hard to grasp, like we should remind ourselves that what section it's in, which is it's ultimately incommunicable. So so I guess just cut ourselves some slack if we have a little trouble with this part, right?
That's right.
Oh, great comment. I was just going over with Deborah simplicity and impassibility. I said, sometimes I study these things, I just don't. I just don't know why I did it. I think it's great. There's no Bible study that I don't enjoy thoroughly. But sometimes I get done with it and I go, okay, I've learned some new words.
Mom.
So I want to say that I watched the video that you recommended. I know Becky did too. And I got a lot out of the idea of God's isness.
Yeah.
I thought that was really good.
Yeah.
God's whatness?
Isness.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it's the, to change the, what is the I am, right? So it's is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, right. Yeah. That's particular scholar and speaker, pastor, James Dolezal. He has done the most recently, he's the one that's done the really good work in impassibility and also in simplicity. So if I would recommend anything he's written, and I'd recommend any of his talks about them. He's very clear-headed and is really good at articulating these somewhat
I have to go downstairs
difficult.
for a second. Hang on.
Okay. So I'd recommend not only that video that I sent out, but any of them. But yeah, the isness of God is really good, and his clarification or maybe exposition of that passage in Exodus, I am that I am, that includes the isness of God. But why is that important? And what are the Israelites asking? I thought that he did a really good job explaining that when the Israelites were asking Moses, what's his name? They wanted to know, on what basis should we believe that he can do these things that you're telling us he said he would do? He's going to take us out of Egypt, the most powerful nation in the world, and establish us as his own people and give us a land, even though we don't have an army. Who is this anyway? Right. And so the answer was, he is the God who is self-existent and needs nothing, is completely independent, creator of all things, sovereign over all things. And if that God says he's going to do it, well, you can count on it, because there's nothing and nobody that can stop it. So that's always good to keep in mind about the God, with whom we have to do. When he makes a promise, it's absolutely certain, and it's not contingent on our strength or our ability to comprehend or even our ability to believe him. He'll still do it. So good stuff. All right, so it sounds like everybody, it's in the last week, everybody's become totally comfortable with impassibility. So I was yeah. So I was ready to address questions, but if there are no questions, we'll move on to the next part in the outline, which is
So what questions were you ready to answer?
whichever questions you brought up, which, you know, there's typically only a couple, that maybe 4 or 5 that come up, generally related to things like relational things, like does God experience emotions? Does God really love us if he's impassible? You know, things like that. So there are more things that we ask because we want to be assured that God really does love us. But I think we all understand that God, you know, God is 100% love and is maximally love. All of his attributes are perfections, and so he is perfect love. And so, of course, when he says he loves you, of course he loves you, and he loves you more and more perfectly, better than you can imagine, and constantly. And there's nothing you can do to make that better or worse, which is a great comfort. And I think that's the thing, actually, that impassibility is meant to bring you to. It's not just some abstract doctrine about what God isn't. You know, he isn't like us, but what he is, which is he's way better than you can imagine. And I like what Anselm said about that God is, there's none greater, that the greatest that you can conceive, God's greater than that. And I think that's always true. So questions like that. So Steve, did you have any thoughts or questions before we move on? It's shaking your head.
Ready to go on.
Ready to go on. Okay. So in the outline, we had started talking about impassibility as a subtopic under immutability. That was on page 5. Immutability, God doesn't change, which means he doesn't change by anything outside. He doesn't change by anything inside of himself. He's perfect, and so he doesn't change. And so on page 6, I had a note about language of the Bible, about accommodation. We talked about accommodation before. I just want to remind everybody, it just, that idea of God accommodating, or that the language being accommodation language, is necessary because we are not like God. And as God says, his thoughts are not, our thoughts are not his thoughts, and his ways are not our ways, and he is so far beyond us. So to accommodate to us, he, as it were, comes down to our level and speaks to us, as in Calvin's phrase, as a nurse might lisp to a baby, you know, to an infant. And so the accommodated language is true and useful and helpful, but it is not comprehensive. And it's God accommodates his revelation to our capacity, basically. And that part of that accommodation in the language has to do with physical attributes. You know, the Bible says in places that God has eyes and hands and a backside and things like that, and that his, you know, feet walk through the water and things like that. And he has wings, you know, like a chicken. And these are accommodations. These are not actually descriptions of God. This is accommodated language, giving us a picture, helping us understand who God is. And the reason I'm bringing it up at this point is just the last thing about impassibility. When the Bible talks about God being provoked to anger and things like that, that this is also accommodation. It's an anthropomorphic way of speaking about God, just like to say God has hands is anthropomorphic. And we tend to have more difficulty understanding the language of accommodation as applied to human emotions, but it is the same thing. It's actually the same. The mechanics of it are exactly the same. God is communicating something to us in a way that we understand that is true, but we need to understand that what's being said is analogical and it's accommodated to us, and we don't want to take it literally and then say God has hands or, you know, wings or something like that. So on page 6 at the bottom, I have point 3, we must keep in mind that there is a difference between God's being and the manifestation of his being.
Mhm.
And so I wrote, God is infinite, immutable, perfect, and omniscient.
I need
But he
to
said-
interrupt you.
Yeah.
What is the title of this outline that you're talking about?
Okay, so it's the one that was the Doctrine of God. So we had,
All right, I still hold on to the impassibility outline.
yeah, there you go. That's okay.
The
Yeah, so
Doctrine of God, let's see if I can find it.
Yeah, we were in the Doctrine of God, and then we took this detour into impassibility because I hadn't stuck it in the outline early enough. And now we're
My
back.
my copy is included with the January 12th email.
Okay.
I found it.
You found it. So
Yeah,
page 6, bottom of page
Got it.
6, I'll just read that again. We must keep in mind that there is a difference between God's being and the manifestation of his being, and that God is infinite, immutable, perfect, and omniscient, but he sometimes manifests himself or reveals himself as finite, limited in knowledge, and provoked to certain emotions. And we had talked about the light and the prism analogy, and that might be helpful to think about that God is, we're seeing on this side of the prism, and God is also explaining to us himself using human analogy in a lot of cases. So when we have no problem when we read God has hands, and arms, but the human emotions being attributed to God are the same type of thing. So that's the point I wanted to underscore. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah, that was helpful.
yes.
Yeah. So talking about infinitude, which is now on page 7, I think, of the Doctrine of God outline. God is infinite, and we'll look at some passages, a whole bunch of them, but start with the definition. To be infinite, it's a negation again. We talked about apophatic language, the language of negation, describing something by saying what it's not. Infinite means not finite. God is not finite. So in God, there is the lack of limitation. So, which is an interesting thing. You can say God lacks something. He lacks limitation. God is without measure. This is a concept that is impossible for me to grasp. I think probably for you to grasp also. There's a thing, there's a something, and you are unable to ever measure it. It is bigger and broader and longer and deeper and higher than you can ever measure. That's immeasurable, unending, and then incomprehensible in the sense of you cannot contain it in a circle. You cannot draw a circle around it. The Bible uses unfathomable as a related word to that, which is you can't get to the bottom of it. It's too deep. And of course, that's just God's infinitude in one direction, right? Yeah.
I'm going to interrupt you. When you were talking about God being bigger than anyone could measure, it's not because we're not big enough. Because if there was a being that was big enough, you still couldn't measure. He couldn't measure God either.
Right. Yeah. That God is immeasurable just by the virtue of his very being. Is we're talking about
Right.
God is so when you think of God in relationship to space, right? So to measure God, that would be, of course, to confine him to a spatial category, right? And
Right.
God is not a spatial creature. Right? He's not within time and space. So he's immeasurable because he's not even spatially confined, which is the point. He has no limitation, no confinement. Spatial creatures are confined, right? We're confined to space, but God is not. I like what I don't remember his name now. One of the Puritans said, God's, speaking of infinitude, said God's center is everywhere, his circumference is nowhere. I thought that's really good. he's also talking about God's omnipresence, right?
Yeah,
God's center is everywhere and his circumference nowhere.
wow.
Yeah. So God is without limitation, without measure, unfathomable. That's a tough word for me to say. And that's because another way to say that is God possesses each of his attributes in perfection, right? And perfection is something that can't be measured. So attributes without measure. So let's look at some passages. I have, and on the outline, point 4 there under infinitude should actually be pushed in. That should be point C under A, B, and C there. That's just, there shouldn't be a point 4. I don't know what happened. I don't know what I was thinking when I made it point 4. But hope nobody is eternally messed up in their concept of God because I have it wrong on the outline.
This changes everything.
This changes everything. That's right.
I get it.
So we'll look at Job 11, 7 through 9. I think we've probably read this passage before about another attribute, and the attributes, even from a human point of view, actually overlap a lot with each other. From God's being, they're the same. We're just looking at different aspects of God's character from a human point of view as refracted through that prism. So Job 11, 7 through 9. Got that, Mom?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Can you find out the deep things of God? Can you find out the limit of the Almighty? It is higher than heaven. What can you do? Deeper than Sheol. What can you know? Its measure is longer than the earth and broader than the sea.
So the point, right? The point is that God is infinite, right? It's we might get hung up on a couple of these earthbound things, right? Its measures longer than the earth. Well, okay, well, yeah, we can measure longer than that. We can measure Mars, Saturn, the end of our universe. We can go to other galaxies. We can measure that. But even if it didn't say verse 8, God's limit is higher than the heaven. What can you do? I think we would understand that what's being said here is that God is not, he's outside of creation. There's nothing, you can measure the things in creation, but outside of creation, there's only one thing, that's God, and you can't measure it. Can't measure him at all. And he's not talking about, how many inches is God. He's talking about God's limit in anything that you can imagine or anything the Bible teaches about God. Can you get to the end of his holiness? Can you get to the end of his wrath? Can you get into his mercy? No, there's no end to those things. They're greater than you can measure, greater than you can conceive. And so this is really it's a really great thing to grasp and to think about. And I also find it really significant that that this doctrine of God shows up in probably the oldest book in the Bible, which is Job. And you have, it's just so great. You have these evolutionary thoughts about religion and how, God was the ancient Israelites thought that God was like animism or something. He's in this tree or something like that. And then over time it developed into a whole bunch of things and finally became monotheistic. It's like, what? No. It was the revelation of the one true God. I mean, the whole evolutionary idea presupposes that the Bible is not the revelation of God. But since the Bible is the revelation of God, what God says about himself throughout the Bible is consistently the same and is full blown from the very beginning. So
I mean, it's along those lines too. It's interesting that that our naturalistic view of the world itself has been the one that's been expanding and evolving over the time to the point that it wasn't that long ago, maybe 100 years ago, that we didn't even know that there was more than one galaxy in the universe. We sort of figured out that we're in a galaxy, but we thought that everything out there was stars in that galaxy. And then we discovered that, wait a minute, there's more universes outside. So it's like, Chuck, to your point, you go back to Job, one of the oldest books, and it presents this view of God that is still consistent with the way that we view him now. Nothing's changed, but our understanding of the physical universe over time is what's expanded to where we're effectively learning more and more about how immense God was by understanding that our view of what we see around us is limited. And the more we learn that, we're expanding that, but it's still less than what God actually is.
Yeah. Now, am I right in the understanding that science has not been able to measure from one end of all the galaxies to the other?
So yeah, I was going to mention that earlier, but I thought it might be a little weird. But I think the easiest way to understand this is that there's this concept of the observable universe, and then what we know and can deduce is the actual size of the universe, which is, for one thing, we don't really know if there's this idea of the Big Bang and that it's expanding, but that's an idea, and it's our best guess at what's going on. But we know for a fact that there's this large circle of what is called the observable universe, which is by definition, we can never actually see outside of that, just because of the way, like, the physics around how light works. Outside of that line or that circle, it's the light that the things that are producing light outside of that are never going to have enough time to get to us to be observed. So there's literally like this observable universe limit, but we know based on observations that there's more universe outside of that, but we're never going to be able to see it. So that's again, I see that as just another, you talk about the general revelation, and that right there is just a like a direct awareness that we can now have, that even God's physical creation is beyond our perception. We can't even fully perceive it all. We know this now, like scientifically, that we have this observable universe. That's all we can ever see, and we know there's more, and we're never going to be able to see it.
Right. So, but theoretically, though, I guess we could at some time be able to observe part of that is now unobservable, if we were to say colonize the very edge of the observable universe.
Nope. It's like, think of like a black hole, where once you pass that line, you're inside the black hole. There's no getting out. It's that same thing. It's literally like there's no way for that light to get. You're saying if we went out to that?
Yeah. If we went to the end of the observable universe.
Sure. Yeah. I suppose, the edges of the observable universe would move if we moved. Right. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
In which case, we might be able to actually see more of the, potentially you could say we could find, all right, now we found the edge of the real universe, but that's obviously complete speculation, and we'd never be able to actually know.
Right. And there would be no reason to speculate that, right? Because actually all of our observation tells us that there's no end to the universe. Yeah,
it's it's actually much more up in the air than, we're sort of told that this Big Bang theory and is pretty solid, but it's really not. And what was your question? Was whether we can know whether the universe is finite or not?
Yeah, well, like at our present state of no, the initial question was, and you answered it, at our present state of scientific knowledge, are we able to measure the universe? And the answer is no. We don't know. We don't even know the limits of the universe.
Right. Yeah.
And then they postulate multiverses, which is just
right.
So you just multiply the problem, right?
Right.
So it comes back to what Jesus said to Nicodemus. He said, if I speak to you of these earthly things, you don't even understand them. How are you going to understand if I speak to you of spiritual things?
Right.
And so when we compare the immeasurability, the infinitude of God, and I'm not saying that the universe is infinite. I don't know. I have nothing to base that on.
Right.
Except since we haven't found the end of the universe, then we can postulate that there might be one, but we've
Right.
really got no reason
How
to
about-
think
how about-
think either way.
How about
But-
the center? Is the concept even of a center of the universe? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. I mean we're I suppose they have some way of deducing that we're sort of, we can see a center, but I don't think so. If you can't really see around, the whole picture, I think it's again just a speculation.
Yeah, it would have to be the center of the observable universe, right?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, so the only point of me asking was just to compare, how mind-boggling our universe is, and then to, the creation of God is so mind-boggling, and we're unable, like Mike said, to comprehend it. We can get hints and things like that, and we can form pictures in our minds that may, maybe have some approximation of accuracy, but with God, the creator, it's even more complex than the problem of the multiverse. It's like, well, he's infinite. I don't know what that means, except that whatever I need, whatever I need, he can supply. That's what the most important part in the whole definition of infinitude is that he lacks nothing. That's the most important thing to me. And but there's other things that are important to other people. People want to be assured that wherever they are, God is with them. Well, that's a really important part of this doctrine as well. So it just really depends on how God has formulated us as his creatures individually, what part of the doctrines become more precious to us. But I am hopefully growing in my maturity in Christ and realizing more and more my utter dependence on God. And so my great my great needs are supplied in God, because he lacks nothing. And so for me, that's like, wow, this is so great. I love this. But we tend to think of, I think, at least when I was a kid, and it's a hard thing to shake off, is when we talk about God being infinite, we think of spatial. It's a line that goes on forever,
Yeah.
That's God. It's like, well, yeah, that doesn't have any actual real application to me.
Yeah, you can't even start measuring God, like, let alone like it, if you think, oh, he's infinite, that means the measuring stick keeps going. It's like, oh, you can't even start to measure him.
Right. It's completely different than anything in our experience. Anything
I
in our
can't think I
natural creation.
ever thought about trying to measure God. That was a thought I don't think I ever had.
Yeah.
But we often, and the Israelites did this, when you read through the Bible, you see it often, very often, where people take the incomparable God and they bring him down to their own level, and they make him like a creature, and they make him like a Canaanite god, or they make him like a king or something like that. And so what they've done then is they've made the immeasurable infinite God finite and measurable, and they bring him down. And God, that's as much a crime as exalting yourself to the presence, and saying, I am godlike, I don't need God because I can take care of myself. That's a terrible thing. It's also a terrible thing to bring God down and say he's like me. So let's look at Psalm 145:3. And I'll also read 147:5, which is, I don't know if that's on your outline. It's in footnote 11, I think. So Psalm 145:3, great is the Lord and greatly to be praised, and his greatness is unsearchable. So that's the ESV. Mike, what do you have there? You have the New King James tonight?
I have NIV right here.
Oh, what's it say there?
Cannot fathom. So God is the Lord and most worthy of praise. His greatness no one can fathom.
Okay. Unfathomable, unsearchable. Yeah, good words there. And this applies to all of the revelation of God's attributes, right? His greatness, that would encompass everything about God. His greatness is without limit, unsearchable. You can't get to it's not just incomprehensible, not that you can't fully understand it. That's true, but you can't get to the end of it. And Shirley, you have the King James. What does the King James say there? Verse 3, what? Psalm 145:3.
Same thing you said. Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised, and his greatness is unsearchable.
Unsearchable. Okay. So I would assume the New King James says that too, right, Mike?
Yeah, unsearchable. Yep.
Yep. So let's look at Psalm 147, verse 5. 147, verse 5. Shirley, can you get that one?
Sure. Great is our Lord and mighty in power. His understanding has no limit and is beyond all measure.
All right. No limit and beyond all measure. All right. So the ESV just says beyond measure. I like the no limit. They convey the same thing though.
NIV just says no limit.
Yeah, it just says no limit. So yeah. So his power and his understanding, and of course all of his greatness is beyond measure. So the Bible teaches the infinitude of God in several places. We've looked at 3 of them. There's another one here.
Actually, just a quick note on like New King James says infinite on 147:5. His understanding is infinite.
Infinite. Okay. Yeah, nice. So Ecclesiastes 3:11 is the next one. He has made everything beautiful in its time. So this is right after there's a time for this, a time for that. The bird's song. That
I'm sorry, what was that? What was the
Ecclesiastes 3:11.
Oh, you're in the footnote. Yeah.
I'm in the footnote.
Yeah.
Yeah.
all right.
He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. And so this one is about God's infinitude from using the argument from the lesser to the greater. So the lesser here, what this passage is about, is that even though God has revealed himself and he's revealed his purposes, he hasn't revealed everything that we might want to know. And he hasn't revealed everything that, about each of us individually and what his plan is and purpose is for everything in our lives. And so what God has said here is that the part about he has put eternity into man's heart or into our heart, this is the thing about people know that they are created for God, that there's more than just this world. And but even though we know that, we still can't find out all of the details about what God wants us to do exactly for us individually and how our individual lives are going to work out from beginning to end, even though God is working in all of these things. And so that's the lesser argument, right? And so the greater is you can't find out that about your life. You can't find out that about God himself. It's just the lesser to the greater. And then the next one was Romans 11:33, which we had also read before. This comes up a lot in the Doctrine of God. Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable his ways. So again, using some of the similar language from the Psalms. And then, so those verses all talk about God in his being, and the last couple of verses talked about God in his revelation to time-bound creatures. But in his being, God is infinite in his greatness and in his perfections. And in his revelation to us, it's unfathomable to us. He hasn't revealed everything, so we can't figure out everything, even about our own life. And then when we apply this, or when the Bible applies this idea of infinitude, and it applies it to time, what you get is God is eternal, right? God. So those verses are Psalm 90, verse 2. That's the first one. And Becky, do you have that?
Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God.
Yeah. Again, not possible to comprehend. This is, right? This is the God who is. He always just is. He's the I am, right? This God, he was there. And which is a weird way of talking, right? About the time before there was time. Because there is no time before there was time.
For us.
Or for God. God doesn't experience, because time is a succession of events, and then involved in that is change from one event to another, or change from one moment to another that's involved change. So
But he lives outside of time.
Right, he lives, and that's how we say it. And we think we understand something when we say that, but I don't think we understand anything.
No, I understand in the beginning, Genesis, that's when time was created, but I don't understand, I can't comprehend how God lives outside of time, other than the fact that I know that he does, because we have a point in timeline where there is a beginning.
Right. So I think the author analogy is helpful there, right? You remember the author analogy, right?
Yes, that was great.
So it's helpful. It might not be, I mean, we can't say that it's 100% accurate, but you can say that at least it's helpful, and you understand how there are, Frodo has an existence, but Frodo's existence started on a particular, Middle Earth came into existence, but from the outside of itself. And there was a time when Middle Earth didn't exist. There was, maybe not a time, but there was a set of circumstances in which Middle Earth doesn't exist, but Tolkien did. He existed in those circumstances. And then Tolkien continues, right, which is a time thing, continues to exist in those while Middle Earth exists. They're existing simultaneously. And then Middle Earth will go out of existence, or will end. It will come to an end. And we understand that with the author analogy, and it might be helpful to think about God. But of course, when you have to describe the relationship with Tolkien and Middle Earth during the time when they're both existing, you apply time references to Tolkien. And so that's where it breaks down. But
right, because there was a point in time when Tolkien didn't exist.
Right. So God created, and then we began, or time began, and time will end, but God will not. God does not. And I think that's the Yeah, it's what Paul said, right? In him we live and move and have our being. But he doesn't live and move and have his being, in us or in time or in any part of the creation. He's completely not, outside of it is a spatial metaphor. He's inside creation and outside creation. But he is not part of the creation. So very, very interesting. Let's look at Psalm 102, verse 12. But you, O Lord, are enthroned forever. You are remembered throughout all generations. So I don't think we need to really comment on that. Ephesians 3:21 is the next one. To him be the glory in the church and in Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever. God is going to receive glory forever and ever. God is therefore the one. Well, with the other passages we looked at, God is the infinite one. The church is not infinite, but the church will praise God forever and ever. So the church is, you could say, immortal, right? So those passages apply this idea of infinitude to time, and say that that God is not bound by the constraints of time. So he's not bound in any of his attributes by any limitation. He has no lack, and he's not bound in his being or in his existence by the strictures of time. And we knew that, but it's also good, to see what the Bible says. And then as applied to space, these infinitude applied to space means that God is omnipresent. He has no limitations of space, which means that he is not confined to here or there. There's no, so let's look at a couple of these passages. So 1 Kings 8:27. 1 Kings 8:27. Mike, can you get that one?
But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the heaven of heavens cannot contain you. How much less this temple which I have built?
So this verse actually talks about not just omnipresence, but more precisely, it talks about God's immensity, that he fills up all of everything, everything in creation is, God is there. It's another way of saying God is omnipresent, but it stresses the everywhereness. I guess I'll say it like this. Often when we talk about omnipresence, we want to bring it down to a point, and we want to make the point that God is with you when you struggle, because he's omnipresent. He's with you, and he's with the Christians in China, and he's with the people in the Ukraine. He's omnipresent. And so we bring it down to a specific point, right? With the people in Ukraine. When we talk about immensity, we say God is like just everywhere. You can't contain him. And that's what this passage in 1 Kings does. What Solomon says, I've built this temple, but wow, it's so inadequate. I mean, all of creation can't contain you. And what he means is the infinite being of God, the unlimited and unrestricted being of God, is not contained within the entire creation, even though it is full. The entire creation is full of the being of God. The being of God is infinite in all directions. Yeah, Mom.
This just underscores for me, I mean, we're going on and on through these things, that this is totally incomprehensible to us. Because our point of reference is our world, our space, our time, our beings. And so you say, when God is with you, and God is with you, and God is with you, I have to fight the impulse to picture God as a great, big, huge circle, but the center of God is with you right now. And then tomorrow he's going to be right there, right? And it'll be the center of him. And the rest of us will just be getting the edges. You know, you just have to fight that impulse to see this in terms of our world and our experience.
Yeah, so this is a really good exercise to really kind of immerse yourself in these incommunicable attributes, because you know when we started out talking about the doctrine of God, I said one of the things that's really, really important is this creator and creature distinction, right? And that God is not like us. And this is the thing that, as you said, Mom, it gets underscored every time we read in the Bible of his self-revelation or somebody speaking about God in a proper way. The thing that's emphasized is he's not like us. So I'm reading through Isaiah right now, and one of the name, I mean, God is called many things in Isaiah, but the one that's repeated at least 35 times is the Holy One, the Holy One. And the primary meaning of holiness is separate. And so holiness for God, being the Holy One, stresses his uniqueness. He is separate. He is separate from creation and anything in it. He's not like those false gods. He's the Holy One, separate from them. He's not like you. He's the Holy One. He's not like his creation. And so the otherness of God is really stressed by that. And that's what these incommunicable attributes, like you said, they just really underscore that God is just incomprehensibly greater. We can apprehend these things. These things are not so beyond us that we can't, it's not gibberish. We understand the words and we can put some of the concepts together, but to fully really understand them or all of the implications is not possible. But it is a great humbling exercise, right? To read these things and to go, this means that God's greater than you can imagine. And then you just go, well, then I can't imagine how great God is. You go, that's right. And that's the takeaway. He's greater than you can imagine. He's present in a way that you can't comprehend. He is holy and loving and merciful infinitely in a way that you can't. You can rely on it, but you can't even have an expectation of what does that look like, because it's better than that. So the opposite of when we talk about the holy God, we haven't got to talk about holiness yet, but just since I brought it up, the opposite of holiness is not unholiness. The opposite of holiness, if God is seen as the holy God, meaning the separate one, the one who is separate and other, the opposite is common. Common is the opposite of holiness. People are common. They're just like other people. You know, things in creation are like other things in creation. They have all the same attributes. They're finite. They're undependable. They're contingent. They're dependent. They are falling apart. You know, all of those attributes are the same for everything in creation. God's not like that. He's completely other. He's separate. So, you know, there are things that are profane, right? To take something that God has set apart, or to take God himself and to bring him to sully that. That's to profane something. That's to make it unholy. But the actual opposite of holy is not unholy, because we're talking about purity, which is a secondary definition. The opposite of holy is common. And so when God in Isaiah says he's the Holy One, he means I'm not like anything in your experience. And that's why he says in Isaiah over and over again, what are you going to compare me to? There's nothing. You can't compare anything to me. So that's stressed that's the thing that when God's people sin against God in the Old Testament, that's the thing they've lost sight of. You take the holy and you make it profane when you bring the holy down to your own level.
That was kind of my point. There is nothing in our experience we can compare God to.
Yeah.
And we have the impulse to try to find something we can compare him to in our experience, but we can't.
Right. And that's why the analogical language is essential, absolutely necessary. That's also why all illustrations, all analogy, all what are they called? I guess they're illustrations of the Trinity, for instance. You're trying to explain the nature of God, right? So you say, well, he's like a clover, it's got 3 petals, or he's like water. Yeah, it's steam, it's a liquid, it's solid, or it's like light, or the sun, it's heat and whatever. And it's like, well, no, none of those actually adequately explain God. They're all actually heretical. You actually end up with an idea about God that is not true if you think he's like those things. God's like a father. He's like me, I'm a father and I'm a son and I'm a brother. God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. That's like me. Like, wow, how nearly blasphemous is that? So this is why these analogies, they're analogies, and we're to take the point of comparison, the point of similarity, and understand that, but not make it a one-to-one correspondence. When we do that, we get heresy, right? So there is no way, because there's nothing in creation that can be compared to God, or to say it a different way, because God is utterly unique. There is no way for us to describe him in a univocal way that is accurate. We can only describe him analogically. And that's the way he describes himself to us. And so we have warrant to do that, right? We have authorization to do that. So, yeah. So all of the concepts we started with at the beginning, God's otherness, the creator-creature distinction, the analogical language, these are things that we're continually reminded of as we look at the doctrine of God. Which is why I started with those things. I thought we have to have some kind of understanding of the language that the Bible uses and why it does that, or else we're going to get ourselves all mixed up. And so, yeah, good reminder, Mom. Thank you. So Isaiah 66, verse 1, very similar to what Solomon said. Thus says the Lord, heaven is my throne, and earth is my footstool. What is the house that you would build for me? And what is the place of my rest? Yeah. So God is stressing his immensity here and his otherness and the inability of something within creation to contain him. So it's uncontainability. The next one is Psalm 139, 7-10. I know this is a favorite of yours, Mom, so you can read that.
All right. Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you're there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me and your right hand shall hold me.
So if Jonah had read this, he wouldn't have got on that boat going to Tarshish. Right? He's out there in the middle of the sea, right? But there's God. He's out there anyway.
So can I tell my story about that? Why this is
Of
so
course.
meaningful to me?
Yeah.
Well, the whole psalm is meaningful to me, but this part in particular. When my father died, I flew to Hawaii for his funeral. That was my second air flight. I was nervous about it. Got there fine. Got on the plane to fly back home, and I was still nervous about flying. And I looked out the window of the plane, and underneath us, there was a bank of clouds. We were above the clouds. I could see the shadow of the plane, and it was completely surrounded by a rainbow, moving with it. And this scripture came to mind. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there, your hand shall lead me and your right hand shall hold me.
That's fantastic. What a great assurance. The
Yeah.
Lord blessed you with that. And, you know, it's a great comfort. And the psalmist is greatly comforted by this. Unbelievers are not comforted by this. John Paul Sartre, or Sartre, I don't know how to say his name. How do you say his name, Mike? Do you know? Is it Sartre? I can't hear you. Oh, you're on mute.
You're muted, Mike.
You're on mute.
Sartre.
Sartre.
I think people usually say Sartre, but if you really want to say it right, you have to know how to pronounce things in French, and I don't really know how to. So,
yeah. So wasn't he the one? Or was it? Yeah, I think it was him who said he couldn't stand the idea of an omnipresent God looking over his shoulder all the time. I think it was him.
Yeah, I don't know, him or Camus, maybe. I'm not sure. It doesn't.
It's too bad.
yeah, too bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you know, if you're sinning and rebelling against God, then of course this is not comforting.
Yeah.
But if you are dependent upon God and you realize your need for him for every single thing, then it's fabulous to know that he's unlimited in his presence. He is not spatially confined.
Right,
That-
because, I still sin, and I regret when I sin, when I am aware of what it is that I have done. But my great comfort is not only is he there looking over my shoulder, but he's forgiven my sin before I ever did it.
Yeah.
And he loves me anyway. It's like, well, there she goes. Yeah, I saw this before I created the world, and there she goes.
Yep.
Yeah, but I love her anyway.
Yeah, I remember seeing Larry Norman, a Christian musician, way back when, probably in the 70s, and he was giving a monologue between songs at this concert, and he said he was explaining God knows you and he loves you, but he was saying it like this: God knows you and he loves you. God knows you and he loves you. Like God knows, even though God knows you, he loves you. I thought, yeah, that's absolutely right. God is good. So this is great. Like I said, great comfort. God is with his people wherever they are, and there's nowhere they could go, and no situation they could be put in where he wouldn't be there with them. And again, this is because of his infinitude, right? This next passage is Jeremiah 23 and 24. Shirley, do you have that one? Hey, Shirley.
Can't hear.
No, I think she's not there. Okay, I'll get this one. Am I a God at hand, declares the Lord, and not a God far away? Can a man hide himself in secret places so that I cannot see him, declares the Lord? Do I not fill heaven and earth, declares the Lord? The same thing as the Psalm 139, except in this case, the people are trying to hide from God. And God is probably laughing at that it's like trying to play hide and seek, right? With somebody in a room with no furniture. So,
It's like my little dog Darby. If he doesn't want to go somewhere or do something or be somewhere, he hides under a chair. And he figures if he can't see you, you can't see him. When I take him to the vet and he's up on the table, he hides his head under my armpit. And we just laugh.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a funny picture. I think that's what this says, right? It
Yeah, I
seems
think
like
so
that.
too.
It's exactly that. Yeah, so God fills heaven and earth, and the only way that I can picture that is, and again, it's just an analogy, is like the creation is a glass with everything in it. Okay, so it's a glass, and so picture this glass fully submerged in a tank of water. And so, and in the analogy, of course, in the picture, the tank is finite, but imagine, the water going on forever. So what you have is a glass suspended in this water, and it's completely and surrounded by the water, and the water is completely inside the glass. It's completely full. But the glass representing everything in creation. So that's, I don't know if we need an analogy to understand this, but God filling heaven and earth, but everything in creation, God being not, we haven't really talked about simplicity, but not having parts. There isn't a part of God here and a part of God there. God is everywhere present. So that's what's being said here. Let's look at, I'm going to skip over Acts 7 and go to Acts 17, 27 and 28. Acts 17, 27 and 28. Ardith, do you have that one?
Sure. 27, 28. Okay. So God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as some of you, your own poets, have said, we are his offsprings.
Okay. So Paul is quoting from a couple of pagan poets here. And the first quote was, in him we live and move and have our being. And then another one, for we are indeed his offspring. So the first quote, Paul is saying, you should seek after God, but it's not like he's hard to find. You don't have to like climb over mountains and go across the ocean to find him, because he's actually not very far. And that's really an understatement of the situation, because he then goes on to say, in him we live and move and have our being. And this highlights something about the omnipresence of God, which is, I think it's brought out kind of implicitly in some of the other passages, but here it's almost explicit. It's a little bit less implicit. And that is that the work of God's providential work of sustaining everything in creation moment to moment is, that's what this quote, in him we live and move and have our being, underscores, that God is sustaining you. God created you and he's sustaining you. In him you live, in him you move, in him you have your being. And that the very fact that God is sustaining everything in creation obviously proves that God is is everywhere in the creation. Because if he wasn't everywhere in the creation, wherever he wasn't would not be sustaining. It would not have been sustained. It would cease to exist. So then this brings in God's omnipresence and ties it to the doctrine of providence, right? Ties it to his sovereignty, his providence. So just checking the time, 8:12. So what have we learned so far, or what have we talked about so far? I don't think we learned anything new, but Anybody have any thoughts at this point, comments? I think on the outline, we're going to move into simplicity. That's going to be another mind bender.
Again,
Again, yes. Still incommunicable, which doesn't actually mean that it's unable to be communicated verbally, but it does mean that it's very hard.
what about we came across a sentence earlier, God's presence in Sheol.
Right.
And
Psalm
the,
139. Yeah.
the dead, not necessarily hell as we understand it biblically, but what can we say about God's presence in hell?
Right. So I think that we would have to say that hell only exists and will only be continuing in existence throughout all eternity because God is sustaining it. And so in some sense, you could say God is there. And well, in the sense that we've been talking about omnipresence, you could say God is there. But so this brings up the language in the Bible where God is said to depart from people or to come to Jerusalem up on Mount Zion because that's where I dwell, things like that. So there's language in the Bible that talks about God being present in some places and not present in others, or leaving places. God left them, right? The Israelites, or in Ezekiel, you have this kind of glory lifting up out of the temple and going away. And what that means is God has forsaken you. But the Temple Mount and all of that continue to exist. So it doesn't mean that God has actually left. It just means, obviously he's still sustaining it. So what do those mean? And is that another kind of a analogical, anthropomorphic type of expression about God? Did God actually leave, like the totality of God's being? Did it actually leave Jerusalem? And you would have to say, no, of course not. Because if God's not there, the place ceases to exist. So the biblical language is, again, about favor or disfavor toward the covenant people. And when they are experiencing covenant curses, their God in favor he's not acting toward them in favor anymore. And I think that's what it means. It doesn't mean, it's not about the Israelites did not think God was some local deity that you could put on the shelf and move from room to room. God is omnipresent. But if you are wicked, it's like the good God that you used to know.
Sorry, could you say that again? Sorry.
No. So anyway, if you have been enjoying the favor of God and then you apostatize, then it's like the favor of God has left, right? Because you're not going to experience it anymore. You're going to experience. It's going to be like you're praying in a ceiling is made of iron, and your prayers aren't going anywhere, and it's going to be experiencing disfavor rather than favor. But it isn't God who moved, right? You're the one who's moved. So, but the biblical language.
Hey, Chuck,
yeah,
I'm thinking through this, and maybe, I was almost heading towards like annihilation or something like that in my mind, but
it's a good thing you stopped that. Yeah,
perhaps I'm trying to work through this, that how is this it's not necessarily the absence of God, it's the absence of any of God's grace. How about that? What you have is just complete wrath.
yes. Yeah, I think that's correct. Yeah, I think that the people in see, ultimately the covenant blessings and curses apply to every person, right? You either will receive covenant blessings for the rest of eternity, or you will receive curse. And heaven and hell are the places where you would receive heaven blessing, hell curse, and so the curse is the expression of God's holy justice and wrath against sin, well, particularly against sinners, who sin. And heaven is the enjoyment of God's mercy and grace, joy and peace, and all of the what we would call positive promises that come to his people through Christ. And so, yeah, so I wouldn't say it's the absence of God, but you can see how people might say that if your knowledge of God, your experience of God is he's a God who blesses me, he is a God who sustains me, he is a God who gives me faith and encourages me, then, well, hell is the absence of that, of course. But if you are wicked, that's not your experience of God. Right? Your experience of God, if you're wicked, is not that he's not blessing your endeavors. You might think that you've achieved something, but it wasn't because God blessed you, because you did it. And so so I think that's right, Steve. I wouldn't say that hell is a place where God is not.
Okay, yeah.
Because there would be no place where God is not. I mean, literally, there would be no place where God was not. Yeah.
Okay.
So does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah, better.
It's not that he's withdrawing, but he is withdrawing or stepping back his relationship with us.
Right.
In that moment.
Right. So the manifestation, so again, it's the difference between the being of God, God in his being, and God in his manifestation. So God shows himself to the hard-hearted Israelites as a judge. That's how God shows himself. He manifests them, but he has not changed. And because God is still 100% love, 100% mercy, 100%, whatever attribute you want to put. But what he's manifesting at that moment is judge. He is presenting himself as judge, angry father, that kind of thing, because they are rebellious. But to the obedient, he manifests himself. What they experience, what they see, is the mercy and the grace and the forgiveness and the love and the provisions and all of that. And so, again, God hasn't changed. When the person changes their relationship with God, so the person is oriented a certain way toward God. Let's say he's facing, in the analogy, he's sitting in a chair, God's over at the right-hand side, the guy's facing him over at the right-hand side of the stage. So terrible analogy if I'm trying to tell the true story, but you get it, right? God's over there on the right, guy's sitting in a chair in the middle of the stage, looking to the right, he's looking at God, and so he has light shining on him. So you can take the light as a metaphor for all the good blessings of God. But the guy then stands up, turns the chair around, and sits down. Now the light is not shining on the front of him anymore. He's in the darkness. He's the light shining on his back. We forget about that, but his face is in the dark. Now he's facing the dark. And so he now has a different experience of the light. In fact, he's not experiencing the light. He's experiencing the darkness. Who changed? Right? That guy changed. God has not changed. And so that's a helpful type of a helpful type of analogy to that. But you have to, of course, limit God and make him like a light bulb, like a light at the corner there. So we don't want to say that that's what God is really like. He's not really a light in the corner, but he uses the metaphor of he's a light, and to walk in rebellion is to walk in darkness. He uses that metaphor in the Bible. So, your word is a light to my feet, and the people who walked in darkness had seen a great light. So we have this metaphor about God's revelation. So we're authorized to use it. So, which is good, because I feel a lot more comfortable not making stuff up about God.
It's one of the things I like about you, Chuck.
Yeah, turns out it's he's here, and he's listening, and he knows. If I say the wrong thing, I hope that he'll correct me, but I fear being corrected as well. So, all right. Well, we only have like 7 more minutes. We're about to get into simplicity, which seems easy. I mean, we could just leave it as God is not a composite being, and then we're done. But I think that it's going to take a little bit more discussion than that, so that you understand why that's important. And I can't do it in the remaining time. And it says my internet connection's unstable.
Yeah, you were kind of garbled.
Garbled. Okay. How long
A
have I
little
been
bit.
garbled? How long?
No, we've been just for a couple of minutes,
Okay.
just
Yeah,
for a
not-
minute, and
not
we've
long
been
at
able
all.
to understand what you're saying.
Okay. Well, does anybody have anything else you want to share before we end tonight? Steve, did you
I
get all your
liked it.
questions?
It
Yeah,
was
good.
good.
No, I'm good. I'm good.
Oh, all right, cool. All right. Somebody volunteer to pray. I'll leave it up to you guys. Everybody confer together. I'll stop the recording.